is the story of Paul and how the church community grew. In our first story of the Acts of the Apostles, we learned about how Jesus came to the apostles after his death and rose after 40 days. Then the apostles received the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, and it was like tongues of flame coming from their heads, and they could speak in many languages. The apostles gathered the people who had followed Jesus, and they became a community. They would teach others about Jesus and his life. They were known as the people of the way. And they grew and grew, becoming bigger and bigger communities, spreading out around the city of Jerusalem and into surrounding communities. There was a special person who loved God and the Torah and the law. His name was Saul. He studied in the temple with the priests and rabbis and wanted everyone to follow the law. But the people of the way spoke of Jesus as the Messiah. To Saul, this was a crime, and they were not following the laws of the temple and the Torah. Saul continued to study and work in the temple, and he was there that terrible day that Stephen, who was one of the 12 apostles, died. Stephen had dared to speak of Jesus as the Messiah and of all the prophecies that predicted his coming. To Saul and the Pharisees, he had broken the law. Saul became one of the people that searched for the people of the way to make them stop teaching about Jesus. Sometimes he arrested them and put them in prison. The people of the way were afraid of him. One day, he was on the road to Damascus to arrest and imprison more of the people of the way, and was struck down and blinded by a bright light. A voice came to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Saul said, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city. You will be told what you are to do." The men with him were speechless, as they could hear but not see where the voice came from. Saul was now blind, and his men took him to a place in Damascus to heal. He was blind for 3 days. Then God spoke to a disciple in Damascus named Ananias, and Ananias said, "I am here, Lord." Then God told him to go and lay his hands on Saul to heal him. But Ananias protested, "I have heard of this man and how much evil he has done to the saints in Jerusalem." But God told him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles." Ananias did come and laid his hands upon Saul, and something like fish scales fell from his eyes, and he could see again. Saul was changed forever. Saul returned to the temple rejoicing and began to preach and tell the story of how Jesus had spoken to him. He told them of how he had been blinded and healed. Now we are to stop persecuting the people of the way. But when the Pharisees heard this, they threatened to put him in prison. Saul escaped and went to the people of the way and told them his story and how Jesus had spoken to him. At first, they were hesitant to accept him because he had persecuted them. They talked amongst themselves and decided he was sincere and they would let him join their community. Then they helped him escape the temple police and leave Jerusalem. Eventually, he traveled to Antioch with other disciples. This was a church community north of Jerusalem, so he could study the teachings of Jesus. Paul studied and preached for 1 year in and around Antioch, and then was ready to go on his first mission with other disciples around the east side of the Mediterranean. They would spread the teachings of Jesus far beyond Judea and Samaria to all peoples. This is a map of the Mediterranean. The red line marks the edge of the Roman Empire at the time of the death of Jesus. You can see that there is a lot of water, and the Roman Empire was very big. The yellow star is Jerusalem, where our story of Paul started when he was still known as Saul. And here went north to Antioch, and that is where he studied. And all of his first missions were all in this area. Because of the large Mediterranean Sea, often he traveled by water. Sometimes there were storms, and once his ship was wrecked on an island, no one died in the wreck, but the boat was lost, and they had to walk across the island to get another boat. This is a map of his first 3 missions. The red line is his first trip, and this is where they may have had a shipwreck and had to walk across the island to get a second boat. Each trip, he went further and further to different places, sometimes by sea and sometimes by land. At each location, he and the other disciples that traveled with him preached about Jesus, baptized the local people, and helped them set up communities and churches. They were often welcome, but sometimes a town would reject them. When that happened, they would just shake the dust from their sandals and move to the next town. They must have had many adventures. When he could not visit the churches and communities, Paul would write them letters to help and encourage them when they had problems. We know more about Paul because he wrote so much about his travels and sent so many letters. Other apostles and disciples traveled to foreign places, but we know less about their stories. But they too helped spread the word of Jesus. Later, Paul made 2 more long trips. Remember, he traveled mostly in this area for the first 3 trips, but later he traveled farther, all the way to Rome and beyond. He went to the edge of France and around Spain and possibly all the way to Great Britain. It's estimated that he traveled over 10,000 miles by land and sea, And this is all before airplanes, cars, and powerboats. Eventually, he was arrested and brought back to Rome, but he continued to write letters to all of the communities he started until he died. The people of the way began to be called Christians. There were times of persecution, and Christians were even killed for their beliefs, but still they grew into a great community. And as Jesus told the apostles, when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth.